There's a question that has stayed with me for years. A question that seems simple at first, yet becomes harder to answer the more you think about it. It began on a completely ordinary afternoon when I noticed my cat sitting by the window. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't playing. She wasn't reacting to any of the sounds around her. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, staring out into the space beyond the glass as if she were watching something I couldn't see. 10 minutes passed, then 30, then nearly an hour. At first, I was simply curious. But the longer I watched, the more that curiosity turned into something else. A strange sense of unease. What was happening inside her mind? Was she thinking? Was she remembering something? Was she feeling sadness, contentment, or some kind of inner experience that I could never fully understand? Or was everything I was witnessing nothing more than a biological system running on instinct? A remarkably sophisticated machine shaped by millions of years of evolution? Then a disturbing thought crossed my mind. How do I know my cat is actually conscious? In fact, how do I know that anyone besides myself is conscious? I can't step inside another mind and verify it. I can't directly experience another person's pain, joy, fear, or thoughts. All I can do is infer what's happening on the inside by observing what happens on the outside. This is one of the deepest problems in philosophy, often called the problem of other minds. From this problem emerges an even more radical idea known as Solipsism. The possibility that your own mind may be the only one that truly exists, while everything else is merely part of a reality constructed around you. Today, this fear often appears in a more familiar form online. What if everyone around you is just an NPC? Imagine waking up in a crowded city filled with millions of people living their lives, going to work, falling in love, having conversations, and chasing dreams. Then imagine discovering that none of them actually feel anything. They're simply programmed characters. The most terrifying part of that scenario isn't that the world is fake. It's the realization that there is no other mind out there for you to truly connect with. Perhaps that's why the question of animal consciousness fascinates us so deeply. Because when we look into the eyes of an animal, what we really want to know isn't simply whether it is conscious. What we want to know is whether we are standing in front of another being that experiences the world from the inside, just as we do. For decades, science has tried to answer that question through experiments. One of the most famous is the mirror test, first introduced by psychologist Gordon Gallup in 1970. The idea is surprisingly simple. Researchers place a mark on an animal's body somewhere it cannot directly see. The animal is then given access to a mirror. If it looks into the mirror and attempts to touch the mark on its own body, this is considered evidence that it understands the reflection is itself. Several species have passed this test, including chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, and even magpies. Dogs, however, generally fail. For a long time, this was taken as evidence that dogs lacked self-awareness. But the deeper scientists looked, the more they realized there was a major flaw in that assumption. The mirror test is designed around human perception. We are highly visual creatures. We identify ourselves through faces, images, and reflections. Dogs do not experience the world that way. For them, smell is the primary source of information. In 2017, researcher Alexandra Horowitz conducted an experiment that has often been described as a smell mirror. She presented dogs with samples of their own urine and then presented modified versions containing altered scent information. The dogs spent significantly more time investigating the altered samples. This does not prove that dogs possess self-awareness in exactly the same way humans do, but it does suggest they can distinguish between my scent and not quite my scent. In other words, if a mirror helps humans recognize themselves visually, scent may serve a similar function for dogs. Realizing this completely changed the way I thought about the question. Perhaps we've become so accustomed to judging other species by human standards that we forget every animal experiences reality in its own unique way. But even if an animal can recognize itself, that still doesn't answer the larger question about the nature of consciousness itself. When we talk about consciousness, we often lump together several very different concepts. The ability to feel pain or pleasure is not the same thing as the ability to think about your own thoughts. In cognitive science, the capacity to have subjective experiences is often referred to as sentience. The ability to reflect on your own mental state, on the other hand, is known as metacognition. One evening, while watching my pet sleep beside me, I suddenly became aware that I was thinking about my own thinking. It sounds strange, but that is exactly what metacognition is. I know when I'm confident. I know when I'm uncertain. I know when I don't have enough information to answer a question. For a long time, scientists believed this ability was almost uniquely human. But over the years, research has painted a far more complicated picture. One of the most influential studies was conducted by David Hampton in 2001 using rhesus monkeys. In memory tasks, the monkeys were given the option to decline a test if they were unsure of the answer. What made the findings remarkable was that the monkeys tended to opt out when their memories were weak and participate when they appeared more confident. In other words, they seemed capable of evaluating the reliability of their own knowledge. They weren't merely responding to the environment. They appeared to possess some awareness of the limits of their own understanding. That may sound like a subtle distinction, but it carries enormous implications. Because it suggests that the line separating human thought from animal thought may not be nearly as clear as we once imagined. Yet even metacognition may not reach the deepest layer of the mystery we call consciousness. In 1974, philosopher Thomas Nagel posed a famous question in his essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" At first glance, the question seems simple. In reality, it strikes at the heart of one of philosophy's greatest mysteries. Bats navigate using echolocation. They construct their understanding of the world through sound waves and echoes. We can study a bat's brain. We can describe the biological mechanisms behind echolocation. We can even simulate the process using computers. But there is something we can never fully access. We cannot know what it feels like to be a bat. We cannot step inside its subjective experience. This is what philosophers refer to as qualia, the private, first-person experiences that exist only for the individual experiencing them. You could spend hours describing the color red to someone born blind. You could explain its wavelength, its symbolism, and the emotions people associate with it. But no matter how detailed your explanation, you could never fully communicate what seeing red actually feels like. Part of consciousness is inherently private. It cannot be transferred. And if that is true for human beings, then what might be happening inside the minds of dogs, cats, elephants, dolphins, or whales? We can observe their behavior. We can measure neural activity. We can study their brains in extraordinary detail. But we may never know exactly what their inner experiences are like. In 2012, a group of leading neuroscientists released what became known as the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. The declaration represented a major turning point in how modern science approaches the question of animal minds. Its central conclusion was that humans are not the only creatures possessing the neurological foundations necessary for consciousness. Many non-human animals possess brain structures associated with emotion, cognition, and subjective experience. This does not mean animals think exactly as humans do, but it suggests that the capacity to experience the world may be far more widespread than we once believed. And yet, some of the most powerful evidence does not come from laboratories. It comes from moments of profound emotion observed in the natural world. In 2018, people around the globe followed the story of Tahlequah, a female killer whale living in the Pacific Northwest. Her newborn calf died only hours after birth. What happened next captured the attention of scientists and the public alike. Instead of leaving the body behind, Tahlequah continued carrying and pushing her calf through the water. She did this for 17 consecutive days, over a journey of more than 1,000 miles. Scientists cannot say with certainty what she was feeling, but it is difficult to witness such behavior without thinking about grief, without thinking about loss, without wondering whether she was experiencing something far deeper than instinct alone. Similar behaviors have been observed in elephants, dolphins, primates, and many species of birds. Elephant herds have been documented returning repeatedly to the remains of deceased companions. Some dogs exhibit dramatic behavioral changes after losing their owners. Certain bird species gather around dead members of their group in behaviors that researchers sometimes describe as funeral-like. Of course, science requires caution. We should not automatically project human emotions onto animals, but we should also be careful not to make the opposite mistake. The mistake of assuming that rich inner lives belong only to us. Perhaps the most surprising discovery is not how similar animals are to humans. Perhaps it is how different they can be while still possessing the capacity to experience the world. When I was younger, I imagined consciousness as a clear dividing line. On one side were humans, with thoughts, emotions, self-awareness, and reflection. On the other side were animals, creatures driven purely by instinct. The more I learned, however, the harder it became to maintain that distinction. The world simply doesn't fit into such neat categories. Maybe consciousness is not something you either have or don't have. Maybe it exists on a spectrum, a vast continuum with countless degrees and forms. Somewhere along that spectrum are human beings. Somewhere else are dogs, cats, dolphins, elephants, and millions of other species. Each experiences reality in its own way. Each inhabits a version of the world that we can never fully enter. And perhaps the greatest lesson modern science is beginning to teach us is this: human beings are not the sole center of conscious experience in the universe. All around us may exist countless other minds, each one representing a unique world unto itself. So the next time you look at your pet, pause for a moment. Watch a little longer. Slow down a little more. And ask yourself what might be happening behind those eyes. Because perhaps the search for animal consciousness has never really been about understanding animals alone. Perhaps it has always been about understanding ourselves. And maybe the highest expression of human consciousness is not intelligence, language, or technology. Maybe it is the ability to recognize the value of another living mind, no matter how different it may be from our own. Because in trying to understand them, we may finally begin to understand ourselves.